Great to be with you today. Great to talk about one of my favorite subjects, international trade. I think it's appropriate that we're sitting here on the Bay with the Bay Planning Coalition, with the Port of Oakland right around the bend, and SFO, where most of our air cargo goes in and out of, right across the bay. So the discussion of what happens with international trade here in the Bay Area and whether it's growing or shrinking has a very big impact on the Bay and as well as on our economy. So as John mentioned, the Economic Institute does a study every 2 years. We just issued the most recent one about a month ago on international trade activity in the Bay Area. And in it, we ask what's happening in the global economy, what's happening with international trade flows, because they're very closely tied to the global economy and where the trade is going to and where the trade is coming from. And we ask about international trade agreements that have the objective of opening markets for goods and service exports. Then we ask, what are Bay Area companies doing? How are they fitting into that pattern? And is trade becoming either more or less important for them in their business activity? And then finally, we look at trade infrastructure. Of course, this gets us back to the main theme here, what's happening with ports and airports and trade infrastructure. So I'll give you just a very quick outline of what we found in our 2013 report. It's up on the web, really easy site, bayareaeconomy.org. You can have all the gory details you want and all the charts if you want to go into more depth. So first, the global economy. So the global economy is growing very modestly in kinds of fits and starts. It is still coming out of the big global recession we went through not many years ago, but it is definitely out of that recession and it's moving forward. It's just not growing really, really fast, but it's headed in the right direction. And if we look at where in the world the trade, the economy is growing and where it's not growing, what we're seeing is either flat growth or negative growth across Europe. It is negative across much of Southern Europe. They're in recession, and they'll probably be in recession the rest of this year. It's right on the margins in countries like the United Kingdom and France. They could dip into recession this year. They're not there yet, but it's a really strong possibility. And then some of the northern economies, the Scandinavian economies, Germany, the Netherlands, are looking rather better. They might be at 1–2% growth, but even they are slowing down. You know, Germany has been the economic engine for Europe. It's sort of been the horse that pulls everybody with it to some degree, and Germany is slowing down too. So that's the point of concern. But the growth or the lack of growth in Europe is pulling down those global numbers because it's such a big part of the global economy. Now, the not so good news out of Europe is largely counterbalanced by pretty good news coming out of the major emerging economies. We shouldn't call them emerging anymore because they're really big and they've been out of the woods for a long time, and now they're just big growing economies. And they are, as has been the case for many, many years now, the last decade at least, they're primarily in Asia, not a huge surprise. Latin America is doing pretty well. And surprisingly, like new on the scene is Africa. Not many years ago, people would have said, oh, Africa, that's a basket case, there's nothing good going on there. But when you look at growth rates in a lot of African countries, they're looking pretty respectable, and they're pretty close to growth rates you're seeing in a lot of developing countries in Asia and Latin America. So I think Africa's a good news story right now, and if you're looking at markets and where there may be opportunities, that's one place to look. The other big stories are China, which is slowing down. Now, they're at about 8% growth, more or less. That's really spectacular by any standard at all. But they're not growing at 10 or 11% the way they were for a decade or more. And they're not going to. They're probably going to see their growth rates falling and staying in that 7–8% range for the foreseeable future. They've reached a level of maturity where you're just not going to see those spectacular growth rates. But I think any of us would be happy to take 8%. India, big emerging market, they've slowed down from about 9 to about 6%. So you're seeing that whole thing basically not grinding to a halt, but much more modest growth than people were expecting a couple of years ago. Of course, Japan, the other big Asian country, we always talk about them separately from China and the emerging economies because they're a member of the OECD, they're a developed economy. We know they've been in recession or in and out or flat growth for many years. So they're at about 1%. So the Japanese government, they're going to do a big stimulus program. They want to jumpstart things. We'll see what happens. A lot of loose money is going to go into their economy. But basically, the Japanese economy, it's big. They're a big market, but it's flat growth, too. So where we're seeing growth, besides China, we're seeing it in Southeast Asia. Those countries average between them about 5.8% growth. That's really, really good. And they're a big market for us here in California. And Africa, they're just about as fast, about 5.7%. So it's a really mixed picture in the global economy. It depends on the country you're looking at, of course. But if we look at our big trading regions that we interact with, we're seeing flat to declining growth in Europe, healthy growth across most of the developing world. So that's where to look for the business. So the outlook for trade, well, obviously, if economies are doing really well and consumers are buying things and companies are investing, they're going to be trading. They're going to be buying, they're going to be selling, and if they're in recession, they're not going to buy or sell as much. And so it's not a big surprise that the trade follows the economies. So we're seeing trade growing very modestly, very unevenly. It's been recovering from the big recession of 2009. You can see on that graph, it just dropped through the floor in 2009. Everything pretty much came to a grinding halt, and then it had this dramatic rebound, more than 12% in 2010, which was fantastic. But then we've seen it kind of stall out in 2011, slowing, and stall out a bit more in 2012. So we failed to keep the momentum in trade growth, and now 2012 into 13, it's sort of coming back. It's turning up again, but we haven't seen the consistent year-on-year spectacular or really strong growth in trade. It's headed the right direction, but it's got a way to go. And I think if this is an average thing across the world, Europe is the big story here. You know, Europe being so flat in terms of their economy. When you take Europe out of the trade picture, you're taking a great big piece of the world economy off the table, and that's what's helping to pull some of those aggregate numbers across the world down. And as long as we've got these sovereign debt issues in Europe that are unresolved, and they won't be resolved at best for a couple or a few years, optimistically, we're not going to see a lot of good news coming out of Europe. Again, we're seeing that already in trade. Companies selling to Europe, you name it what it is, I'll bet that if you're selling to Europe, you're not doing really well. You're not seeing growth. You're probably seeing declining sales. U.S. automakers, other companies, consumer goods companies, by and large, are seeing falling sales to Europe. So the big growth in trade, no surprise. Emerging markets, Asia, South America, and Africa. So the trade negotiating agenda. So trade agreements, all this is impacted by our access to markets. And of course, trade agreements, international bilateral agreements, are designed to open markets and improve access and improve opportunities to do business. So as you all know, going back many, many years, there have been the global negotiations under the World Trade Organization, the Doha round, multilateral negotiations, a grand bargain covering many, many sectors. That process has missed deadline after deadline after deadline over the last decade, really. And it's essentially dead. You know, it's sort of twitching out there now and then. But I think most governments are moving on. They're not investing a lot of effort in that. And of course, if you can get a global deal, it's the most efficient way to open markets. But I don't think anybody expects a global deal. We might get some sub-agreements because there's a lot happening in individual sectors in the WTO. So I think you may see a renegotiation and updating of the Information Technology Agreement that's been very instrumental in opening international markets to trade in information technology products. And the Obama administration and others are starting to push for a big global agreement on services trade. Not going to affect much traffic through the Port of Oakland, but it will maybe affect the number of people flying on business in and out of SFO. Bilateral FTAs, or free trade agreements, are the way most governments are going now, and the U.S. has done that as well. You might remember that the Bush administration negotiated 3 before he left office. It was with Colombia, Panama, and Korea. For basically political reasons, those were left on the table, and they weren't acted on by Congress until last year. And last year, the administration expressed support for them. They were passed by Congress. So now we have new agreements that will open markets in Panama, Colombia, and Korea. And of those, for us here in the Bay Area, Korea is the story. We don't sell a lot to or buy a lot from Panama or Colombia. Korea is one of our largest trading partners. So opening that market up is a big deal for us here in the Bay Area in California. And if you're doing business with Korea, you'll want to look at that agreement because the lid is coming off. It's already off on a lot of products. It's going to come off more on other products as time goes on. So the 2 news stories which are worth tracking, one is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Talks began in 2009. They're picking up now. It's a regional free trade agreement of the U.S. with a number of Asian partners. We started with 7, and they were, let's see, Australia, Brunei, Chile, Peru, is Asia Pacific partners, New Zealand, Singapore, and Vietnam. Last year, Canada and Mexico decided to come in, so they're very big. The interesting thing is most of those are countries we already have free trade agreements with. So the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, basically strings them together and makes more of a critical mass that hopefully anchors the U.S. trade presence in the Asia-Pacific area more effectively. I think what's really interesting to follow in the TPP, though, is Japan. Because Japan has never been a part of any free trade negotiation with the U.S. There's a lot of reasons why it hasn't. They're very sensitive on agricultural imports. It's not the easiest market in some respects, and so they've stayed away. Last year, the Japanese government, really earlier this year, said they're going to join the negotiating process. And it's a big move by the current Japanese government to say, we have to do something to jumpstart our economy. They're going to launch a lot of money in the economy, they're going to lower the value of the yen, but it's a big play on their part to say we are going to seek a free trade agreement with the US and Mexico and Canada and all those other Asian countries. So it's going to be difficult, but watch that, because if the TPP is successful and that Japan is part of it, that's going to be a very, very big deal for us, because Japan is one of our 3 or 4 largest trading partners in the world. The other interesting story is Europe. Again, if we look around the world, where do we have free trade agreements? We don't have anything in Europe, but negotiations have just begun on what's called a European Union Comprehensive Economic Agreement. Basically, it's a free trade agreement with the 27 countries of the European Union. And it's just getting underway now. And they are, of course, even if their economies are flat, even if they're not growing a lot, they are huge as trading partners and as investors. And I think one incentive for the Europeans to come into the free trade tent is that they see this as a way to jumpstart their economy, just like the Japanese are trying to jumpstart their economy by being part of the TPP. So again, this is going to be a really difficult negotiation. There's a lot of tough issues on the table. You can imagine the complexity of negotiating with one country, say Korea, versus 27 countries in the EU. Lots and lots and lots of interest, big interest at the table, lots of voices. Agriculture, it's just a bigger problem talking to the EU about agriculture as it is Japan. But if this goes somewhere, if it's successful and they're pushing a fast timeline of a couple years, then that would be a big deal for us and a huge opportunity for anybody involved in trade. So let's get to the Bay Area. So we're the 4th largest trading region in the United States. If you combine the metropolitan statistical areas that are part of what we call the Bay Area, we're the 4th largest after New York, New Jersey, which of course is just really huge. Houston area, a lot of oil, that's really oil and petrochemicals. And the greater Los Angeles, Long Beach area, where of course you've got the ports of Los Angeles and the ports of Long Beach. So we loom really large by any measure on the international trade scene here in the Bay Area. And what are we selling? Well, we're selling a lot of technology. We sell a lot of other things too. We sell apparel, a lot of consumer products, processed foods, yeah, wine. We're the biggest wine exporting area in the country for obvious reasons. Lots of services which are hard to track. But the big story is technology. And you can see on the graph here that technology product sales haven't been exactly booming out of the Bay Area when you talk just about exports. Like everything else, they took a dive in 2009, and now they're coming back up. So we're in a pretty good place right now. But you can see from where we were back in 2000, Texas is kind of coming up. Not that we need to worry about Texas, but nevertheless, it's worth noting, I think we don't make as much here physically as we once did, and their production has gone to other places, and so we're just not selling quite as much as we used to in the area of high technology. But it is still what really dominates Bay Area exports by value. I didn't mention agriculture. You know, as we all know here, a ton of agriculture from the Central Valley goes out here through the Port of Oakland overseas. Lots of other things, but again, the technology is the big export by value. Most of that tends to go out, but not all of it, in the belly of aircraft out of SFO. So let's focus on this for a moment, because I think this is an important part of the story of why trade is important to all of us here in the Bay Area. So going back about 10 years, the Economic Institute has done a survey of leading companies across a range of industries, basically asking the question, where do you get your revenue? Do you get it from domestic sales in the US, or do you get it from sales overseas? So every other year, every 2 years, we look at that and we see what's the trend, where's it going? So the last time we looked was 2010, then we looked at 2012. So there's two bullets, and they're different stories. I'll just go through the first. So we started with 38 companies 10 years ago, 50 companies 10 years ago. There's 38 now because some went away. Some were merged. So we got 38, but they're the same companies we've followed all along. So of those, 28, most, saw both their international sales and their domestic sales rise. 7 saw their international sales rise, but domestic sales fell. And 2 saw domestic sales rise, but international fell. So what that says really is that the weighting of their business activity in terms of growth in sales, it's in the direction of international. Not to say domestic sales aren't growing for some, but there's more growth in international markets for them than there is here at home. Of those same companies, I should have said 38 rather than 30. Anyway, of those, this is the more important thing. 22 of those saw the share of revenues, the percentage of revenues from global markets increase compared to their domestic sales. 12 saw the share of revenues from domestic markets increase relative to global markets, and 4 is about the same. So what this really says, it makes the point much more clearly that we are seeing a continuing shift. Certainly over the 10 years the Economic Institute has been tracking this, a continuing shift where Bay Area companies are increasingly focused and increasingly dependent on global markets for their revenues. That whole process stalled out after the last big recession. You know, you saw that dip, 2009. There was nothing happening. But that was a pause. Now we're back on the same track we've been following for more than a decade. More and more dependent, more and more focused on global markets for revenues. Which takes us to the infrastructure, the trade gateways. We're really talking here about the Port of Oakland primarily and San Francisco International Airport. Just like everything else, the last big recession, 2009, trade going through Bay Area ports and airports dropped like a rock. Trade through the ports dropped about 10%. Trade through the airports dropped about 30%. We're only now getting back to pre-recession levels. And one of the interesting stories here is when you look at SFO, we're seeing a continuing drop in air cargo through SFO. Even with the economy doing better, here and internationally, we're seeing air cargo continuing to decline. This just shows the share by airports. But we're seeing a rebound in shipping traffic through the Port of Oakland. So the port is doing much better. It's come back to pre-recession levels, and the projections are for continued healthy growth going forward. In the longer term, there's a question about the Panama Canal when they get the expansion open. Right now, about 70% of all imports into the U.S. From Asia arrive at West Coast ports. Of course, that's primarily LA and Long Beach, also Oakland, of course. 61% of that moves east by intermodal transport, about 38% through the canal. When they open up that canal, there will be the opportunity to take bigger vessels through and go around rather than to the West Coast. So I think people are positioning themselves for that. Finally, the question, who do we trade with? Well, you can see down below, you can see the regions on the top, and you can see the countries down below. Obviously, this is California now. Mexico and Canada, huge. China is the interesting story. They've been coming up. As long as we've followed this for more than a decade, they used to be number 7, then they were number 6, then they're number 5, and now they're number 4 among all of our trading partners, actually moving ahead of Japan. But you know, that's reflecting the huge growth in China, the growth in consumer markets, and the flatness of Japan's economy. But that's not to discount the importance of Japan, because they're still an enormous market, and they're still our number 4 trading partner. Then you see South Korea. Remember the free trade agreement with South Korea. That's why they're so important. If you look at those 15, 7 are in Asia, several are in Europe, and then we find Brazil and a few others there. So it just does indicate the weighting of our trade activity in the direction of Asia. And what are we selling? Well, like I was saying before, the big product by value, it's everything in technology. It's computer, electronic products, lots of other stuff, machinery used to make computer and electronic products. But you can see a lot of sales there in agriculture and food products, waste and scrap out of the Port of Oakland, petroleum going out of the North Bay. So the last thing I would mention, and I'm glad to see Kish Reg on here, is the California Trade Office. Those of you who followed this for a while might remember that until about 2003, the state of California had the largest network of international trade and investment service offices of any state in the country. There were, I think, about a dozen or so at one time. And then in that big budget crisis, and for a variety of reasons, all those offices were closed. And for about 10 years, the state had effectively no overseas representation to help companies do business in those particular markets. Last year, legislation was passed that really created and provided resources for the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and legislation was also passed that enabled the state government to partner with private entities to open these kinds of trade offices in other countries. And the first one is in China. It's a partnership with the Bay Area Council, and when the governor was in China a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that happened was there was an official opening of the California Trade and Investment Office, which is in Shanghai. So that's good news. California is back on the map in being officially represented overseas and being officially in the capacity to help its companies do business in that market. It leaves open the question of whether other trade offices will open in the future. The governor said the next one, if there is another one, will probably be in Mexico. So, you know, this is not a tidal wave of offices opening all at once, but the opening of the office in China reflects, for obvious reasons we've been discussing, the importance of China to our economy here, and also, a new factor, its possible importance as a source of foreign investment coming into California as they're starting to invest more and more overseas. For a long time, the investment money was flowing into China, and now it's actually starting to flow out of China, and people are looking to see how they can capture some of that. So some good news on the California trade front, and with that, I'll just wrap up these short remarks, and if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to take them.